Hello and welcome to the fourth video in this series on the Ten Commandments. So the video right before this one, I talked about the beginning of Israel, mainly Exodus 1 through 19, chapters 1 to 19. I also talked about the pre-story, and I'm calling Genesis the pre-story, the preface, the prolegomena, that which you say ahead of time, which may be a new way of thinking of it. Because if you're like me as a Christian, you think, well, the Bible begins at Genesis. And because I'm a non-Jew, the idea of starting the story with Adam makes a lot of sense. In fact, the Gospel of Luke, which is one of the stories of Jesus in the New Testament, it goes all the way back when it's giving the family tree of Jesus. It goes all the way back to Adam. Why? Well, one reason is because the Gospel of Luke is primarily written to non-Jews. And one of the main themes of the Gospel of Luke is that the story, that the good news is for everyone. Jesus is for everyone. And so Luke may even be a non-Jew himself. And so it makes sense that the gospel that says the gospel's for everybody would focus on going all the way back to Adam. Now, let's go to Matthew's gospel, the very first story of Jesus in the New Testament. Matthew is the most Jewish gospel, and Matthew's audience is probably a Jewish audience. Matthew also has a family tree of Jesus. Where does the family tree of Jesus start in Matthew? It starts with Abraham, which fits with the previous video I was just saying. And so when we read the Old Testament as a Jewish book, and of course it's a Christian book too, but when we try to read it for its original connotations and how an ancient Israelite would have thought of some of these books and stories, it makes sense for us to start with Exodus, because it's here that Israel really gets going. That's the real beginnings of Israel. And so when we get to chapter 20 of Exodus, the Israelites have left Egypt, they've escaped, the soldiers of Pharaoh have drowned, and they've come to a place called Mount Sinai. And here on Mount Sinai, they get the Ten Commandments. Now, you may have heard of the Ten Commandments. We're going to go into them a little more detail in a second. You may have heard of them before. The Ten Commandments are very important for me. Growing up as a Christian, well, of course, I've heard of the Ten Commandments. Even people who aren't particularly Christian have often heard of the Ten Commandments. And you might think, well, of course, the Ten Commandments, that's the heart of the Old Testament. And I mean, it's not entirely wrong to think of the Ten Commandments as the heart of the Old Testament. But let's think for a second about this. The Ten Commandments are some of the most universal is one of the most universal parts of the Old Testament. Things like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, do not steal. These apply to everybody. In fact, most laws of most people, well, there aren't laws against adultery anymore. There used to be, but there are laws against murdering people. There are laws against stealing from people. And that doesn't matter whether you're Christian or non-Christian. The laws of most countries say don't steal and don't kill. And so it makes sense that we, like I'm a non-Jew, it makes sense that when I read the Old Testament, I would especially be attracted to the Ten Commandments because I see myself in them. They apply to me. And by the way, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, is a very Jewish-oriented commandment. We'll talk about that in a second. And so it raises this question. To what extent do the Ten Commandments play a large role in the Old Testament itself? Do we find the Ten Commandments being referenced over and over again in the Old Testament? Are the Ten Commandments as important for the Old Testament as the Ten Commandments are for me as a universal person, Christian? And I think what we find is the Ten Commandments aren't mentioned a lot in the Old Testament, which is very interesting. In fact, the parts of Exodus that I kind of, does that really matter? You know, things about sacrifices, things about, you know, what happens if my ox gores your ox, you know, what do I have to pay you? Those sorts of Israel, you know, don't trim the edges of your beard in Leviticus. You know, don't wear clothing of mixed thread. Don't eat eel. Don't eat pig. These parts of the Jewish law that I think of, well, that belonged to them. That belonged to Israel. That's ceremonial law. You know, that's not my law. Those were much more important to a Jew than they are to me. I tend to think, well, obviously the Ten Commandments are important because they apply to me. But again, it wasn't written to me. It was written for ancient Israel. I mean, that doesn't mean that I can't get something from it. It doesn't mean that there aren't principles that I can apply to my life. It's just in terms of understanding it, in terms of what it actually meant, I need to know first what it meant when it was written, because that's who it was first written to. And so the Ten Commandments may seem more important to me than they were within ancient Israel. I'm not saying they weren't important, but it is interesting when we read like 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings that they don't seem to know the law as well as I do. It's very interesting. For example, did you know that the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Old Testament, it says that you're not supposed to offer sacrifices anywhere except the place where God designates his name. Well, where is that? Well, after the temple is built, it's in Jerusalem. Before the temple is built, it's wherever the sanctuary is. What's funny is we find Elijah, a prophet in the northern kingdom, offering sacrifices everywhere. And we find Samuel, this is the #1 spiritual person. We find him offering sacrifices all kinds of places other than the one sanctuary. It's almost as if they don't know the law. I mean, you read about the festivals. We're going to talk about the festivals in a second. And yet, do we hear about these festivals in books like Judges? We hear about one festival, the yearly festival of Yahweh. But what about tabernacles? What about the festival of Passover? What about the festival of Pentecost? We don't hear about the things that are in the law that much. And there may be a dynamic here that we want to explore at some point. And that is that ancient laws did not function the way modern law functions, it seems. Modern law functions as something that is very much in place. So if I break the speed limit and I'm caught, I'm going to have to pay a fine. I mean, these laws aren't just, somebody blogging. These are actually enacted. We have police, we have courts and things like that. And so it would seem that ancient law, like the Code of Hammurabi and so forth, to some extent, these ancient laws may have been more like statements, position papers, than actually enactable law. I'm not saying that's entirely the case, but it seems like these were more philosophical pieces in the ancient world than they were actually operational pieces all the time. When we think about the judges that ancient Israel have, we inevitably think of them like we think of our modern judges. But it seems like for example, the judges of the book of Judges, it seems like they kind of, as needed, God raises up judges as they're needed. These don't seem to be people who day to day are judging cases within Israel. I mean, take Samson. We don't have any evidence that Samson ever judged any case within Israel, and yet he's one of the judges. And so probably law was taken care of by local elders in a very tribal way, the way that you would expect Native Americans or African tribes, as you picture them, to have handled matters of dispute and so forth. We should not picture ancient Israel as having a thoroughgoing legal system the way that we're used to in the Western world. And so the Ten Commandments give us core principles, of course. They do, very important. And later Jews will use the Ten Commandments as a lens through which to look at all the little laws that follow in, for example, the rest of Exodus and so forth. So I'm not in any way dismissing their importance. I'm simply pointing out this paradigm shift idea that I'm going to be hammering over and over again. And that is that we, without even realizing it, read our own assumptions into the biblical text. Well, what are the assumptions of the biblical text? The assumptions of the biblical text are the assumptions of the time in which the biblical texts were written. This is a very important principle for understanding the Bible. Well, is that enough preface? I'm sure you're thinking that's plenty of preface. Get on with it. So let's talk about a little more concretely about the background of the Ten Commandments. So as we try to get back into their heads, there were these kinds of treaties that they had. For example, Hittite is an ancient people mentioned in the Bible. They were up in modern day Turkey, that area. They pre-existed the New Testament. the Old Testament, but they have these kinds of treaties called suzerainty treaties. These were arrangements between a ruler and a people where the ruler would basically say, I'll protect you, I'll fight for you, I'll provide for you, and in return, you serve me. And some have argued that the Ten Commandments have a form that would have been recognizable in the ancient world as a kind of suzerainty treaty, basically where God says, I am the Lord, I brought you out of Egypt, therefore you will have no other gods before me. Therefore you will not take my name in vain. Therefore you will, and so forth and so forth. And so this kind of you scratch your back, I scratch my back, we have a word for it, we call it a covenant. But in the ancient world, there's this sense of a treaty between a ruler and their people, where God is king and the people serve God. That may be a form that the Ten Commandments would have fit into in the mentality of the ancient Israelites in what's called the ancient Near East. The kind of law in the Ten Commandments is sometimes called apodictic law. Apodictic law is a kind of like don't do it law. So like don't touch the stove. That's different from what's called case law or casuistic law. Case law is if this happens, then this is the punishment. That's case law. If this, then this. But the Ten Commandments are apodictic law. It's like, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not kill. And so that's the kind of law that we find in the Ten Commandments. By the way, there are different numberings for the Ten Commandments. Different groups number the words differently. For example, the Jews might prefer to call it the Decalogue, the 10 words, where the first word is actually, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. It's not even a commandment, it's the condition of the commandments. And so the number one word is a statement, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And therefore, the second word is, you will have no other gods before me. And in the Jewish reckoning, it goes on to say, you will not make any idols of me. That's those two, what I as a Protestant would consider number one and number two. Number one for me is, you will have no other gods before me, and do not make any graven images. These two are just one command by the Jewish reckoning. And so the first word in the Jewish reckoning is, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And then the second word is, you'll have no other gods before me, and don't make any graven images. So there's different wordings. Interestingly enough, Catholics and Lutherans number them differently as well. So for Catholics and Lutherans, those two are also just one commandment. You will have no other gods before me, and don't make any graven images. That's the first commandment for Lutherans, and it's the first commandment for Catholics. And it's the first commandment for both of them. And then what we find is when we get to the 10th commandment, for me as a Protestant, most Protestants, the 10th commandment is, thou shalt not covet. Well, Roman Catholics and Lutherans take that and divide it into two. You will not covet your neighbor's house, you will not covet your neighbor's wife, and so forth. So different wordings, different numberings for the 10 commandments, but they're all the same commandments, all the same words, but different numberings, which you say either, I say either, it works either way. There are other law codes. I mentioned the Code of Hammurabi, which dates from around the time of Abraham, famous command, some similarity. So for example, the law of retribution, sometimes called the lex talionis, an eye for an eye or a tooth for tooth, that actually is found before the Old Testament. The Code of Hammurabi is older than the Old Testament. By the way, all truth is God's truth, right? The eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Just because it came before the Old Testament, just because it came before Moses, doesn't mean that's bad. Oh no, there's something that the Old Testament borrowed something from another culture, or there's some Egyptian proverbs that Solomon, that the book of Proverbs has taken over some Egyptian proverbs. Our reaction shouldn't be, oh no, what's going on? Because all truth is God's truth. God can inspire people who aren't in the people of God to say true things. Again, maybe inspire is not the right word, but not all truth is if it's not in the Bible, it's not true. I mean, there are lots of things that aren't in the Bible that are true. My coffee pot is black. Okay, that's true. It's not in the Bible. And so there can be truth that isn't in the Old Testament. In fact, I know a pastor who was concerned when he found out that the pattern for the temple, the Jewish temple, was not unlike the pattern of other temples. No, this is how God works. God meets people where they're at, and then he speaks to them within their frameworks, and he takes them further from there. We'll talk more about incarnational revelation as we go through this course. There is, of course, the importance of holiness in that ancient world. Something is holy if it is set apart to God. And that's the primary root meaning of holiness in the Old Testament. Something is holy if it belongs to God. And of course, God is holy because God is God. And so holiness is that which pertains to God. Now, this is surprising because let me tell you what's surprising. The prostitutes to other gods were considered holy to that God. You know, when I first found this out, it was like, does not compute, does not compute. How can something that's a prostitute be holy? Obviously, there's no prostitute that's holy to the true God. I'm talking about like Baal and other kinds of Canaanite gods. We get a sense of the root meaning of holiness by realizing that they considered the prostitutes of other gods to be holy to that God. What does that mean? That prostitute was set apart to the other God. And so the root sense of holiness in the Old Testament is something that is set apart as God's. And this is not just a logical thing. This is a fall on your face kind of thing. And we get a sense of the holiness of God from Mount Sinai, because if an animal even touched the mountain, it had to be stoned to death. Basically what we're getting at here is, because the Mount of Sinai was set apart to God and was made holy, it was plugged into God. It becomes electrified, it becomes magnetized. It's Godified. And so you don't just mess with it. Have you ever been near a power station where you can kind of hear the zzz of the electricity? This mountain is Godified. It's plugged into God. Don't touch it. You might get shocked. And we read of a story in, I think, 2 Samuel, where a guy named Uzzah is watching the Ark of the Covenant, which was a very important part of the temple. He's watching the Ark of the Covenant on an ox, and it begins to kind of wobble. And this guy reaches out to try to steady the Ark, but he's not supposed to touch it. You're not supposed to touch the Ark. You're not holy. And zap, he's dead. And you think, well, what? And it actually upsets David. Why did you do this, God? But it's not that, it's no hard feelings. It's just, this is holy. You can't touch a 20 million volt fence and expect not to die, and so this is Godified. Don't touch it. But hopefully you're beginning to get a sense of what holiness means in the Old Testament. Holiness is not primarily about moral purity in the Old Testament. It's about being set apart as God's, being on the God side of the line. Okay, so there are two kinds of commands in the 10 Commandments. The first 4, by my counting, are commands that have to do with loving God. You might know, or you might not know, that when Jesus in the New Testament is asked, what is the essence of the law? He says 2 things: love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbors yourself. That's it. Everything that God expects of humanity can be summed up in either love God or love neighbor. Well, the 10 Commandments can actually be divided by those commandments that relate to loving God and those commandments that relate to loving your neighbor. And the first 4 commandments have to do with loving God. So the first commandment by Christian reckoning is, you will have no other gods before me. The before me is very intriguing because it sounds like, are there other gods out there? And this is an interesting line of thought. I don't want to spend too much time on it today. But for example, Paul says in the New Testament, one of the major New Testament authors, he says, don't go eat at a pagan temple because that's like going to demon restaurant. And this is interesting because in high school, I grew up thinking, those silly Greeks, they thought Zeus was a god. Those silly Greeks, there's nobody at the Parthenon. Athena doesn't exist. But that's not really the way that Paul views pagan temples. To Paul, pagan temples are full of demons. Maybe not the demon Athena, but full of demons. And it's almost as if you were to take Paul's view of Baal, one of the gods of the Old Testament, or Paul's view of Ashtaroth, one of the goddesses of the Old Testament, Probably Paul would say they are spiritual beings. They're just demonic beings. I mean, Paul might not call them gods per se, but do you understand what I'm saying? To the Israelites, there probably were other spiritual beings. To the Israelites, Dagon probably was a Philistine spiritual being. We would call them demons maybe today. But when the commandment says you will have no other gods but Yahweh, you will have no other gods but me, it doesn't, this is this idea that I'm going to try to sell you throughout this series of videos, that God meets people where they're at. And the ancient Israelites lived in the middle of a thoroughly polytheistic, a many God concept. And God doesn't give them the full shebang of monotheism, one Godism, all at once. He seems to kind of spread it out. Isaiah 45 is a high point for monotheism in the Old Testament. But it may very well be that God starts with these baby steps and he says, you know, those other gods out there, don't worship them, just worship me. And there's a name for that. It's called henotheism. Heno it comes from the Greek word for one. So it's kind of like monotheism. Mono is the Latin word, for one. And so there's a similarity between the word monotheism and henotheism, but henotheism here is the idea that there's only one legitimate God. There's only one God for Israel to worship. There are other gods out there. Okay, I'll tell you more that they don't really exist or that they're demons later on. But what you need to focus on is one God, the El Elyon, the highest God, God Most High. That's who you need to focus on. God meets them where they're at. He takes on he meets them in their paradigms, in their worldviews, and takes them further. Again, see what you think about it. We'll have time to discuss that, no doubt. So no other gods but the one God, and him alone will you worship. It's also called monolatry. Worship one. Don't worship the others, just worship one. And so no other gods but Yahweh. No idols. Do not make any images of God. We are the image of God. Interesting. We are the true idols of God. And of course, Jesus is the par excellence image of God. Colossians 1, for example, calls Jesus the image of the invisible God. But we are not to make little figurines of God. And in fact, the Ark of the Covenant, which was when I'm going to talk about the tabernacle, the sanctuary that Israel worshipped from in ancient Israel, it had an innermost chamber where there was this thing called the Ark of the Covenant. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones movie is built off of the Ark of the Covenant idea. But the Ark of the Covenant was this box, and on top it had these two angel figures. And it seems like the angel figures' wings were kind of pointing. So on the one side, they're pointing this way, and on the other side, they're pointing this way. And they're both pointing inwardly to this empty space. Now, any other God, any other nation, any other religion, any other people, there would have been a figure of the God. If you were to go to the Parthenon in Athens, there was a statue of Athena. And so there was a Roman general by the name of Pompey, who in the year 63 actually came into Jerusalem. He marched into the Holy of Holies. And he was very, very puzzled. Where's the picture of your God? I mean, your God's not here. There wasn't anything there. But this is part of the uniqueness of the Jewish understanding of God, that you are not to make images of God. And we would say that when we talk about God, the face of God, those sorts of things, the nose of God burning, an image of God angry, that these are pictures. These are anthropomorphisms. They're portraying God in human categories that we can understand. Goo goo gaga talk. That God himself is beyond our comprehension in those senses. That we're not to pretend like we can make a figurine of God that would come anywhere close to who God really is. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain, the third commandment by my Protestant reckoning. This is not about cussing, by the way. It is about invoking the name of Yahweh in an oath. You hear about this in Matthew 5 when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, if you make an oath, be sure and keep it. That's what this is about. Oath taking was very important in the ancient world. And it was a very important that if you swore by Yahweh, if you say, I swear by Yahweh that I da 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 da, you had better do it, because if you don't, that's really, 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 really bad. In fact, in the book of Judges, we hear about a foolish man by the name of Jephthah, who swears by Yahweh that if he wins a battle, he will sacrifice the first living thing that comes out of his house. And it turns out being his daughter. And then we have every reason to believe he goes through with it. He gives her a few months to mourn the fact that she's going to die without ever getting married or having children. And then, as far as we can tell, he sacrifices her when she comes back. I think he's foolish. I think God would have let him out of it. But he keeps his oath. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. If you take an oath in the name of Yahweh, you'd better keep it. By the way, Jesus undercuts this commandment by saying, why take oaths at all? If you're a truthful person, if your yes means yes and your no means no, then you don't have to swear by Yahweh, because everybody will know that when you say something, you really mean it. The fourth commandment, by my reckoning, is to remember the Sabbath day, to set it apart, to keep it holy. This is an interesting one. And of course, I think it's a great idea. God came up with it. It's got to be good. This idea is very unique, I think, in the ancient world. This is one of those examples of where God doesn't just work within the categories of the day. He takes it further. And the Sabbath day is just astounding, really. The ancient world wasn't known for giving people days off. Let's say that the modern day weekend that we enjoy was not something that has been around for all time. In fact, it's a fairly recent invention. And so the idea that there would be one day from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday that people would not work, that's incredibly crazy and wonderful idea. And I think that as Christians today, we would be smart to continue to take time off. And of course, most Christians would say, I do it on Sunday, that the day doesn't necessarily matter as long as we're doing it. Pastors, of course, work on Sunday, so they tend to take another day off, maybe a Monday or sometimes a Saturday or a Friday. But what's interesting is Paul and Jesus in the New Testament clearly say this should not become a matter of what we might call legalism. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And this is an important orientation toward the rules in the Bible. The rules in the Bible weren't meant to beat us over the head. The rules of the Bible were actually meant for our benefit. Sabbath is for our benefit. And Jesus, some people get on Jesus for letting his followers pluck grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus basically says, well, first of all, he says, I'm pretty important. But also he says, there's a time to make exceptions to these kinds of rules. These rules aren't absolute in the sense of you don't make any exceptions to them. My disciples need food. They're hungry. They plucked some grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus says that's okay, because the Sabbath wasn't made as a kind of bed that you have to lie in. And if you're I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of Procrustes. Procrustes would take people, this is a Greek myth, when a people would come to a city, if they were too tall and wouldn't fit his bed, he would chop their legs off so that they fit. Or, if they weren't tall enough, he would stretch them out. A Procrustean bed is a bed that you have to exactly fit. That's not the manner of God in the law. In God, the Sabbath rule was meant to help humanity, not to torture humanity. Paul goes even further. Paul says in Romans 14, one person considers one day more important than the others. Another considers them all the same as God's, that everybody be fully convinced in their own mind. So Paul doesn't, he says in Colossians 2, don't let anybody judge you in regard to a Sabbath. And so this rule is very Jewish centric. It is, of course, we should do it. We should absolutely do it. But in terms of law, the New Testament does not major on the Sabbath commandment as a command that is important for all Christians to follow legalistically. So the last 6 commandments are commands that have to do with loving our neighbor. And you'll know many of these, if not all of these. Honor your father and your mother. This respecting of your elders was very important and it's been in most cultures, it's very important. In fact, you might argue that one of the fallen features of Western culture right now is that we tend not to respect our elders. That's a failing, I think, of our culture. I think we would be better as a culture if we would have more respect for our elders and for those who are older. I'm doing this video at the beginning of 2021, and I just found out today that one of my aunts, who's in her late 80s, has COVID. This is making this video in the time of COVID. And I'm fearful that whether she'll make it or not. She's in a nursing home, and let's just say I don't feel like she's well treated necessarily. I'm not saying that all nursing homes are that way, but I do feel that sometimes I'm just going to use her example. Sometimes I feel like she may be kind of out of sight, out of mind, somewhat neglected, and hopefully she'll get the treatment she needs. But again, I'm trying to talk about something that's, I think, true of United States culture is we tend to discard the elderly. Not everybody, but there is a tendency in certain parts of our culture to look down upon older people. This is not at all the way of the Old Testament. It's not the way of most cultures where the elders are respected. In fact, interestingly enough, in America, you might get slapped if you ask a woman her age. But in China, I understand if you were to ask an older woman what her age is, she would more likely smile and with great pride tell you how old she is. The age is a sign of dignity in Chinese culture. So honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. That's still a goodie. Definitely not professors. Don't murder your professors. I think that's in the footnotes. Do not commit adultery. Be faithful to your spouse. Do not steal. Again, a bedrock of most cultures. Do not bear false witness. Now, certainly we can find biblical passages that talk about not lying. I think of, like, for example, Ephesians and so forth. Truth clearly is associated with God in the Bible. I do think, however, that this commandment probably was more about a legal context, because remember, we don't have video footage of crimes in the ancient world, and so a lot of punishment was based upon eyewitness testimony. You maybe heard the verse, on 2 or 3 witnesses something will be established. And so it was very, very, very important in that world for those who gave witness to give truthful witness. And so this is a very important commandment in the world of ancient Israel, that you need to tell the truth when you are bearing witness. Do not bear false witness. That's really, really bad. And do not covet. Covet, this is interesting. Covet here is not just, man, I like your car, or something like that. This is covet with intentionality, I think. This is covet with, I really like your stuff so much that if I get a chance, I'm taking it, or I really like your wife so much that if I get a chance alone, I'm going to make, covet here is it's stronger than a passing thought. It is a real disposition and intentionality that basically fantasizes about getting other people's stuff or other people's spouse and so forth. Do not covet. And we'll find when we get to the New Testament that Paul uses covetousness in Romans 7 as an example of something that without some help from the Holy Spirit, we're just not going to be able to beat covetousness. But that's in the New Testament. Okay, before we end this video, that's the 10 Commandments. I want to talk a little bit about the chapters that come after the 10 Commandments, chapters 21 through 40. The chapters immediately following the 10 Commandments are sometimes called the Book of the Covenant. And this is case law, some of this case law I'm talking about. If an ox gores your ox, here's what you do. It's in this case law that we find the law of retribution. Eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, this sounds very harsh. If I accidentally poke out your eye, then you get to poke out my eye. But really, we have to remember that the ancient world was a very, very harsh world. When we get to the book of Joshua, where they kill everything in Jericho, we have to remember that the ancient world was a brutal, brutal world, a very cold world. I mean, we have such a privilege to live in the civilized world that we live in today. And so some have suggested, and of course, remember the law of retribution predates the Bible, goes back to the law of Hammurabi. But this was a world where if someone poked your eye out, they might poke both your eyes out to get back at you. So there's been some argument that in the ancient Near East, the law of retribution was actually meant to limit retribution, not to guarantee retribution. So it's more about making sure you don't take both of my eyes if I only take yours. That's more of what it's about than like, make sure you get that eye. If he took yours, it's more about limiting retribution than guaranteeing retribution. In these last chapters of Exodus, we learn about 3 yearly festivals during which the Israelite male was supposed to appear before the Lord at the sanctuary. Festival of Passover, which of course remembers the Exodus from Egypt. The Feast of Pentecost, which is a harvest feast, celebrating the bringing in of the harvest. The Feast of Tabernacles, which remembered their 40 years in the desert. We'll hear about the 40-year wandering in the desert in a bit here. And of course, we have the setup of the sanctuary, the holy place of Israel, the portable temple, as it were. And since I mentioned the portable temple, let me go ahead and talk about the structure. So you entered the courtyard here. So there was a courtyard. This is open space. There's no roof on it. There's the altar of burnt offering when you come into the courtyard. And this is where the animal was sacrificed on the altar of burnt offering. This is a laver where there's water to purify yourself. There's no soap. It's more, what we would think of it as more ceremonial than actually hygienic. So that's interesting. Again, we read things in, we bring our dictionary to the Bible and of course see what we think is there. But they didn't think of microorganisms. They didn't know anything about that. So it's more of a ceremonial, what we would call ceremonial cleansing. Then after something was sacrificed on special occasions, it was brought into the actual structure itself. And there were 2 parts to the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting. The first one was the holy place, sometimes called the holies. And the second part was called the most holy place, or the holy of holies sometimes. I've already mentioned the Holy of Holies had the Ark of the Covenant. It was a box. Inside the box were some, the 10 Commandments were in there. A famous rod that Aaron, the priest, had that budded. Some manna, we'll hear about manna soon enough. And the cherubim, the 2 angels pointing toward empty space on top. So that's in the most holy place. Only the highest priest, called the high priest, surprisingly enough, was allowed to go in here, and only once a year on what was called the Day of Atonement. In Hebrew, Yom Kippur, still celebrated today, Day of Atonement. But daily, other priests went into this first chamber, the outer room, where there was an altar of incense. This is, of course, I'm making this video as we've just gone through Christmas. You may know the story of the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah, who goes into it's his turn to go into the holy place, the holies, and his function is the altar of incense. And he sees the angel Gabriel while he's administering the altar of incense. There's also a table of showbread that was supposed to have bread on it regularly, and a lampstand in there. So this is the construction of the tabernacle. Let me go back. This is an example of case law, and I'm using this because it deals with a contemporary issue. If men struggle and strike a pregnant woman, and her children come out and there's no injury, he will surely be fined, as the husband of the woman will put upon him, and the judges give. But if there is injury, he will give life for life, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This is case law. It's if-then law. And very interesting, we have a little bit of the law of retribution here at the end. The debate is, what is the injury here? Is it injury to the pregnant woman or is it injury to her children? And what does her children mean? Does her children mean just to be very brutal here, is it the pieces of the child that come out? I mean, the ancient world is a rough place. It really is. But you can see that this is a key passage in debates about abortion and so forth, whether the Bible would view a child, because if it's saying no injury to the child, then it's considering the child before birth as being a full-blown human being in which eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so forth. On the other hand, if it's talking about the woman, then it's not taking into account, there is a fine, but it's not taking into account the child that was in there. And so again, of course, there's the New Testament too. We don't just apply the Old Testament directly to today, I would say, without taking the New Testament into account. And there is a little bit of spiritual art to applying Scripture to today anyway. We need the help of each other as a church, I think, sometimes to wrestle with how to apply Scripture. So regardless of the interpretation of this passage, it doesn't give us the final answer on those sorts of things. We need to take the whole counsel of God and the whole of Scripture into account. But I wanted to give you this verse as an example of some case law, and different versions translate it differently, sometimes depending on what the theological understanding of the translators are. Okay, the final part of Exodus. Sorry, this is going on a long time. We hear in this final part about what the priestly garments are supposed to be like. Remember, they're going to be ministering in the tabernacle, in a holy place. And so they've got to be set apart. They've got to dress the right way. This is a holy place. Now, that may not apply to modern churches. I mean, there are some people who think, no, you can't go barefoot in a modern church, or maybe you should go barefoot in a modern church. I've never heard anybody argue that. Or you can't run in the church, or you can't have food in the church. Sometimes people have used the model of the ancient sanctuary for the modern church. That's a question. It's a legitimate question whether that's a legitimate parallel between the ancient sanctuary and the modern church. And probably most of you watching this video won't think that that's a appropriate parallel. But there are, of course, sacrifices. Christians believe that Jesus gave us the sacrifice to end all sacrifice. We don't have to kill goats anymore, or bulls, or doves, and so forth, because they were all symbolic in the first place, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament says, telling us about Jesus in anticipation. There's the incident with the golden calf. Moses is up on the mountain with God getting the 10 commandments, and the people get antsy, and they're like, we need to sacrifice something. Can you make it, and they actually convince Aaron to make a golden calf for them to worship. They donate all their gold, they melt it down, and they make a golden calf. And then Moses comes down and he's like, and he breaks the 10 commandments. But anyway, then they are directed. They kind of go in circles after they don't believe, but at least God is directing them in circles. There's a cloud during day and a fire by night to tell them which way to go. I want to end this video with what I might call the Old Testament creed. Now, the Old Testament is not really creedal. I don't know what church you grew up with, but some churches have creeds. Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, or even the Nicene Creed, creator of all things, seen and unseen, and so forth. Christianity is often very creedal. The Old Testament is not very creedal. The Old Testament is much more about how to live than it is about what to believe. Actually, I would say the New Testament is much more about how to live and how to think, how to be in your heart. I would say the New Testament is more about how to be in your heart than even it is about how to behave. But the Old Testament is very much focused on how to behave. Nevertheless, there is this statement that appears multiple times throughout the Old Testament. It's the closest thing to a creed that the Old Testament has. And I want to end this video with it. Yahweh, Yahweh, this is Exodus 34, a God who is merciful and gracious, who is slow to anger, who is abounding in steadfast love, and that's a Hebrew word worth knowing, abounding in chesed, God's covenant love, God, and faithfulness, and true, keeping faith, keeping his chesed to thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet by no means just dismissing the guilty, but he visits the iniquity of the fathers on the sons, and on the sons of the sons to the third and the fourth generation. So we find this multiple times in the Old Testament. My favorite place where we find it is in Jonah 4:2, where Jonah has been told to go to this city named Nineveh and to tell them that God's going to fry them. And as you know, Jonah resists. You may not know. Jonah resists. He goes the opposite direction. He's swallowed by a fish. He says, okay, fine, I'll go. The fish throws him up. He goes to Nineveh. He says, you guys are going to fry. And then he goes and sits so that he can watch the city fry. And then the city does a funny thing. The city says, maybe God will forgive us. We're sorry. We'll change. And they really mean it. It's not just we're sorry and they don't mean it. They mean it. And then God says, okay, I'll give you a reprieve. And Jonah's like, I knew this. I knew that you'd forgive them. And I mean, this is the attitude Jonah has. I knew that you were merciful and gracious and slow to anger, and you bound in love, and you forgive people of their sins. I wanted to see the city fry. And Jonah actually turns out to be the bad guy by the time the book of Jonah is up. So we find it in several places in the Old Testament, this statement that God is love, which may not be what you've heard. You may have heard that the God of the Old Testament likes to fry things. Well, the God of the Old Testament actually is a loving and gracious God. He does visit the iniquity of those who don't repent, of those who don't turn their ways. He doesn't forgive them if they have not repented. And we'll talk a little bit later on in these series of videos about this idea of visiting the children for the sins of their parents. Of course, it's very male-oriented in the language here, but it probably applies to women as well. We'll talk about gender in the Old Testament at some point in our journey here. And so this is remember, this is one point in the journey. This is at the point of Moses. We will hear some updates in the progress of understanding to this last part when we get to Ezekiel and to Jeremiah. Well, I've gone on too long on this video, but there we have it, a video on the 10 Commandments, etc.